The city of Houston was alive with the hustle and bustle of everyday life, a blend of crowded streets, office buildings, and a warm, humid breeze that carried the scent of barbecue from the food trucks lining the sidewalks. Amid this urban chaos, one particular neighborhood was nestled quietly in the shadows of high-rises and shopping malls, a neighborhood where families lived and dreams were quietly made. In this neighborhood stood a gym, a popular one, known for its well-maintained equipment, bustling energy, and its fitness guru, Jake Henderson. Jake, a gym instructor in his early 30s, was a familiar face in the fitness community of Houston. He was muscular, toned, and known for his unrelenting passion for fitness and a healthy lifestyle. His clients trusted him, and his reputation as a no-nonsense trainer had earned him a loyal following. But despite his success, Jake's personal life was far from perfect. Behind the gym, behind the muscles, was a man struggling with the woman he loved. Amanda Henderson, Jake's wife, was once the picture of fitness and health. She had met Jake in college, where they had bonded over their shared love of staying fit. They got married a year after graduation, and for a while everything seemed perfect. But over time, Amanda had started gaining weight. It wasn't extreme at first, but it became noticeable. Amanda's diet and exercise routine had slipped, and while Jake continued to maintain his own physical form, Amanda's health began to deteriorate. One evening, just 24 hours before the tragic events would unfold, Jake and Amanda sat down for dinner in their modest home. The kitchen was filled with the smell of grilled chicken and vegetables, a meal that Jake had prepared himself. As Amanda sat down at the table, Jake looked at her, his brow furrowed with a mix of concern and frustration. "Amanda," Jake said sharply, his voice steady but firm, "you've got to stop eating like this. I've warned you over and over again about the weight gain. It's not healthy. You're not taking this seriously." Amanda, who had been busy with work all day and was eager to relax, looked up at her husband, a frown crossing her face. "I'm trying, Jake. It's just hard sometimes," she muttered, pushing the food around her plate. "I've been stressed, you know that." Jake shook his head, his expression hardening. "You say that every time, Amanda. Stress is no excuse. You're letting yourself go, and I can't keep watching this happen. You're gaining more weight every month. What's next? You don't even care about your own health anymore. This has to stop." Amanda felt the sting of his words, but instead of responding with anger, she remained silent, staring down at her meal. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from Jake, her husband and the man who had once inspired her to take better care of herself, was different. She had gained weight, yes, but she was still the same person she had been when Jake had fallen in love with her. Why was he so fixated on this? Jake stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "I'm serious, Amanda. If you don't start taking care of yourself, I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this. You need to change, or this marriage won't last." Amanda's face flushed with embarrassment, and she looked up at Jake, who had already turned his back to her. His words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She had tried, she really had. But life wasn't always as simple as the workouts and meal plans Jake pushed on his clients. She wasn't like them. And yet here Jake was, his perfect physique a constant reminder of what she felt she could never achieve anymore. The tension between them thickened in the silence that followed. Amanda pushed the plate away, her appetite lost, and sat back in her chair. But Jake didn't notice. He was already walking out of the room, his gym bag slung over his shoulder. He had clients to train early the next morning, and Amanda, feeling defeated, was left alone in the kitchen. The next 24 hours would change everything. The following evening, Amanda was found dead in the couple's home. She was discovered by a neighbor who had grown concerned when she hadn't heard from Amanda all day. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Amanda lying face down on the living room floor, a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Everything seemed normal except for the lifeless body of Amanda Henderson, lying in the home she once shared with her husband. Jake was nowhere to be found. Detective Sarah Ramirez was the seasoned investigator assigned to the case. She had been with the Houston Police Department for over 15 years, and she had seen it all, from robberies to homicides. But this case felt different, The young woman, a wife, had been murdered in her own home, and there were no clear suspects. Everything pointed to Jake Henderson, the gym instructor husband, but there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime, at least not yet. Detective Ramirez took a long look around the scene, noticing the subtle details. The house was immaculate. Everything was in its place. There were no signs of a break-in, no valuables missing, nothing that pointed to a robbery or an external threat. It seemed like Amanda had been killed for a reason, personal, not random. As Ramirez began her investigation, she learned more about the dynamics between Jake and Amanda. Neighbors described Jake as a man who was tough, disciplined, and sometimes a little too intense. His gym was his life, and his commitment to fitness had become his obsession. And according to those close to Amanda, her weight gain had been a source of tension in their marriage for months. Jake had grown frustrated, and Amanda, feeling self-conscious and distant, had become more withdrawn. The detective also discovered that Jake had been out of town for a training session the day before Amanda's murder, but he had returned late in the evening, hours before her body was discovered. His alibi was shaky, and his response to the news of Amanda's death seemed unusually unemotional. "Detective, I don't know what happened," Jake had told Ramirez when questioned. "I was just so frustrated with her. We'd been arguing about her weight for weeks, but I didn't think it would lead to this. I loved Amanda, I did. But there was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right with Ramirez. There was no visible grief, no real emotion in his voice." She pressed him further, asking about the arguments, about the warning he'd given Amanda the night before. Jake's responses were evasive, his eyes darting nervously. "She was always so difficult," he said, his voice trailing off. "But I never thought she'd end up like this." Detective Ramirez wasn't convinced. She had seen how guilt could manifest in many ways, and Jake's behavior seemed more like someone trying to cover something up than someone grieving the loss of a loved one. Over the next few days, the investigation began to uncover more layers. Jake's gym members came forward, confirming that the gym instructor had been pushing Amanda harder than ever in the weeks before her death, berating her for her lack of discipline. His obsession with her weight had consumed him. He wanted her to be the perfect wife, the perfect image of fitness, and when she failed to meet those expectations, the pressure became unbearable. A search of the Henderson home revealed Jake's gun, registered to him. Forensic evidence found traces of Amanda's blood on the weapon, and ballistics confirmed that the shot that killed her came from that very gun. Jake was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was a spectacle that captivated the city. Jake Henderson, once a beloved fitness expert, was now on trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution laid out the evidence: Jake's obsession with his wife's appearance, the tension in their marriage, the threat he had made just hours before Amanda's death. The defense argued that Jake had never intended for things to go that far, that the shooting was a moment of blind rage and regret. But Detective Ramirez, having followed the case from start to finish, knew the truth. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was the result of a toxic obsession, a controlling husband who couldn't accept that his wife didn't fit the mold he had created for her. Jake had pushed Amanda to the brink, and in the end, he had snapped. Jake Henderson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. As Ramirez stood outside the courthouse, the case closed, she couldn't help but feel a sense of justice for Amanda. But she knew that, in the end, no verdict could bring her back. The city of Houston would move on, but the memory of Amanda Henderson, a woman caught in the grip of someone else's expectations, would linger forever. Detective Sarah Ramirez sat in her office, reviewing the case files on Amanda Henderson's murder. The details were still fresh in her mind. The lack of evidence pointing to anyone but Jake Henderson, the frustration of the witnesses, and the chilling demeanor Jake had displayed when questioned. It was all a bit too clean, too rehearsed. But there were still many unanswered questions. As she sifted through the reports, one thing was certain: Jake had been hiding something. Over the last few days, Ramirez had begun to piece together more of the couple's troubled marriage. Amanda and Jake's relationship, once seemingly perfect, had unraveled in the months leading up to her death. The more Ramirez dug, the clearer it became that their marriage had been held together by fragile threads of resentment and control. Jake's obsession with fitness had spilled over into their personal lives, and it seemed to have turned toxic. As a gym instructor, Jake had always maintained a perfect physique and preached the gospel of fitness to his clients. But as Amanda's weight slowly increased, Jake's intolerance and frustration had grown. It wasn't just Amanda's weight that had caused tension, though. Jake's constant criticism of her eating habits, his cold remarks about her appearance, and the guilt trips about her lack of motivation were taking their toll. He had become her coach, her critic, and her husband all in one, with no space for her to breathe, no space for her to be herself. What struck Ramirez the most was the warning Jake had given Amanda the night before she died. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was a threat, disguised as concern. Ramirez had read the conversation over and over in the interview transcripts. Jake had warned Amanda about her weight, told her that if she didn't change, their marriage might not last. Those were the last words she had heard before the tragedy. But despite Jake's harsh words, Amanda's friends had told Ramirez that she had been making an effort. She had been trying to regain control over her health, visiting a nutritionist, and getting back into a regular exercise routine. But it wasn't fast enough for Jake. In his eyes, it was an all-or-nothing battle, and Amanda was losing. One of Amanda's closest friends, Carla, had described how Amanda had confided in her about the growing strain in her marriage. Jake used to be her biggest cheerleader, Carla had said, but over the last few months, it's like he couldn't see her for who she really was anymore. He'd criticize everything she did. He'd get upset if she ate dessert, and if she missed a workout, he'd go on and on about it. It became too much. I know she was trying, but Jake was relentless. The word relentless stuck in Ramirez's mind. It wasn't just criticism, it was an obsession. It was control. It was an unhealthy fixation on perfection that Amanda could never live up to. That was the dangerous line Jake had crossed. It became apparent that Amanda's efforts to improve herself had only made things worse. She joined a weight loss program, but Jake's relentless comments only pushed her further into a corner. Amanda was struggling, and instead of offering support, Jake had only created more pressure. He seemed to be obsessed with the idea of controlling not just his wife's weight, but every aspect of her life. The more Ramirez spoke with those who knew Jake, the more she heard about his perfectionism. A former colleague at the gym recalled how Jake had once told him, "People who aren't disciplined will never be able to achieve their goals. If you want results, you have to push yourself, push everyone around you." It seemed that Jake's attitude toward his wife was an extension of his own philosophy. He expected nothing less than perfection, not just in his clients, but in his marriage as well. And when Amanda failed to meet that standard, the frustration built, slowly but surely, turning into resentment. There was no question in Ramirez's mind that Jake had built up an anger, a resentment so thick that it had finally exploded. The warning he had given Amanda about her weight gain wasn't a moment of concern or care. It was the final buildup of months of verbal abuse disguised as motivation. Jake's obsession with his wife's physical appearance had crossed a line, and in his mind, killing her was a way to rid himself of what he viewed as an obstacle to his perfect world. The investigation continued to unravel more about Jake's character. Detective Ramirez received a report from the forensic team that revealed something disturbing. They had found traces of alcohol on Amanda's breath, despite no alcohol being found in the house. The report also noted that Amanda's body showed signs of having been moved post-mortem. These details were unsettling. Could it be that Jake had come home, drunk and frustrated, and in a fit of rage, killed Amanda? As Ramirez pored over the evidence, she made another key discovery. Jake had claimed he was home only briefly the night of the murder and had given his whereabouts up until late that evening. But the details of his alibi started to falter. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Jake's car parked in a secluded area just moments before Amanda was shot. The timing was off. Jake hadn't been home as long as he had led police to believe. With this new evidence, Ramirez requested a more thorough investigation into Jake's background. She wanted to see if there were any previous incidents of violence or aggression that might have gone unnoticed. What she found shocked her. Jake had been involved in a minor altercation a few years ago with a fellow trainer at the gym. The altercation had been about something trivial. Jake had been accused of pushing his colleague too hard during a fitness competition. It seemed like a small, unimportant incident, But when Ramirez dug deeper, she found that the aggression had been a recurring issue with Jake. He had a temper, a short fuse, and when things didn't go his way, he could explode. At one point, a former client had even filed a complaint against him for being verbally abusive during a training session. It was dismissed, but the pattern was clear. Jake had a history of taking his frustrations out on others. He had learned how to manipulate his clients with words, with discipline, and it seemed he had tried to do the same with Amanda. With this information in hand, Ramirez approached Jake for another round of questioning. He had already been arrested based on the initial evidence in his shaky alibi, but Ramirez needed to hear it from him directly. She needed to hear him break down, confess, and give her a glimpse of the monster behind the facade. When Jake was brought in for questioning, Ramirez could see the cracks beginning to form in his otherwise calm demeanor. He was no longer the confident, composed gym instructor who had walked into the station earlier. He was nervous, sweating, and looking around the room like a trapped animal. "Jake," Ramirez said, leaning forward, "you've been lying about your whereabouts. You didn't go straight home after your training session, did you?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "You're lying," Ramirez said bluntly. "You were at that gas station. You parked in that secluded area. Why, Jake? Why not go straight home?" Jake's silence spoke volumes. His eyes darted nervously around the room. Then finally he sighed deeply and looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to do it. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't watch her ruin herself." Jake's admission hung in the air like a heavy cloud. His confession wasn't a moment of guilt or remorse. It was a cold explanation of his actions. He didn't see his wife's death as a murder. He saw it as a release. In his mind, Amanda had been a failure. She had let herself go, and he had no choice but to rid himself of the problem. The trial was swift. The prosecution had more than enough evidence to convict Jake of first-degree murder. Witnesses, the forensic report, his confession, everything pointed to him being the one responsible for Amanda's death. It wasn't a crime of passion or a heat-of-the-moment mistake. Jake had killed his wife because she didn't live up to the impossible standards he had set for her. Jake Henderson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Ramirez, despite the conviction, still felt a sense of unease. It was clear that Amanda had been trapped in a toxic relationship, and she had paid the ultimate price for it. The case was closed, but the damage done by Jake's obsession would linger forever in the memories of those who had known Amanda. As Ramirez closed the case file, she couldn't help but wonder how many other people, behind closed doors, were suffering in silence, controlled by the same kind of toxic love that had led to Amanda's death. The weeks following Jake Henderson's arrest and conviction had passed in a blur for Detective Sarah Ramirez. It was hard to shake the feeling that this case had left a stain on her, one she couldn't quite scrub away. The murder of Amanda Henderson, the seemingly perfect wife of a man who had built his life on discipline and physical excellence, had exposed a darker side of obsession and control. The trial was over, and Jake had been sentenced to life without parole. But for Sarah, the case was far from finished in her mind. What disturbed her most was the question that lingered. How could someone who had once loved their partner, who had once built a life with them, come to such a tragic, irreversible end? Jake had crossed a line, there was no denying that. But his obsession with Amanda's weight, her image, her imperfection, had not been born overnight. It was a pattern, a slow, creeping poison that had worked its way into their marriage. Sarah knew that Amanda's struggle with her weight had not just been a physical issue, it was emotional, mental, and psychological. And it was clear to her that Jake's relentless behavior toward Amanda had turned into something far more sinister. His control over her, disguised as concern for her health, had stripped away her sense of self-worth. He had belittled her, manipulated her, and ultimately pushed her into a corner where there seemed to be no escape. But what Sarah didn't understand, and what continued to haunt her, was how Amanda had lived with this for so long. Why hadn't she left him sooner? Why hadn't she stood up for herself against his cruel words and harsh demands? The answer, Sarah realized, was in the very nature of toxic love. A love that wasn't love at all, but control disguised as care. Amanda had tried to regain control of her life. Yes, but it had been difficult to see the truth when she was living in a constant state of self-doubt. In a way, Amanda had been complicit, not out of choice, but because she had believed that she was failing. She had convinced herself that Jake's anger and criticism were justified, that it was her fault that things had fallen apart. She had been trapped in a cycle, believing she had to change, to fit into Jake's vision of perfection in order to keep their marriage intact. This realization hit Sarah hard. She understood that the psychological abuse had been just as damaging as any physical violence. Jake had been her manipulator, and Amanda had been caught in his grip. But the hardest part of all was that Amanda had never been given the space to truly be herself, her authentic self. She had been buried under the weight of Jake's expectations, drowning in a world where she was never enough. A few weeks after the trial, Sarah received a call from Carla, Amanda's close friend, who had given the initial interview during the investigation. Carla had remained in contact with Sarah throughout the case, and with the trial over, she now wanted to share something more personal, something that Carla had kept to herself out of respect for Amanda. Carla asked if they could meet, and Sarah agreed, curious to know what more there was to uncover. The two met at a small cafe in the heart of Houston, a cozy place where they could speak privately without interruption. Carla looked tired when she sat down across from Sarah. She had been affected deeply by Amanda's death, and the pain was still evident in her eyes. She took a deep breath before speaking, as though gathering the courage to say what she had kept silent for so long. "I never told you everything about Amanda and Jake," Carla began, her voice shaky. "I didn't want to speak ill of him when you were investigating, but I can't keep this to myself anymore." Sarah leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. She had heard bits and pieces about Jake and Amanda's relationship, but Carla had always been careful to speak only of the positive aspects of their friendship. Now Sarah could tell that Carla was holding on to something important. "Jake wasn't just hard on Amanda about her weight," Carla continued. "I mean, yes, he was obsessed with her fitness, but it was more than that. He controlled her entire life. Every decision she made, from what she ate to who she spent time with, everything was monitored. He didn't let her have any freedom." Carla paused, as though unsure how much she should reveal. "Amanda tried to break free several times. She started to hang out with us more, tried to go out with her friends, even started to do things on her own. But every time Jake would get so angry, he'd make her feel guilty for wanting time apart, for enjoying herself without him. It was like he had to have her all to himself. He couldn't stand the thought of her enjoying her own life, of her being independent." Sarah absorbed this new information carefully. It painted a clearer picture of the type of relationship Amanda had been trapped in. Jake hadn't just been a controlling husband. He had been an emotional and psychological abuser. And that kind of control, as Carla described, could be just as suffocating as any physical violence. Carla's voice trembled as she continued. "One night, not long before the murder, Amanda confided in me. She said Jake was threatening to leave her if she didn't get it together. She felt like she was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to keep him happy, trying to fit into his perfect little world. But she was starting to realize that no matter what she did, it was never going to be enough." Carla wiped away a tear and looked down at the table. Amanda was exhausted, Sarah. Exhausted from trying to please him. She wanted to leave, but she didn't know how. She didn't think she was strong enough to do it on her own. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had known that Amanda's death was a tragedy, but now hearing Carla's words, the depth of Amanda's struggle was becoming painfully clear. It was not just a battle of physical appearance, but a battle of autonomy, of self-worth, and of freedom. "Carla, why didn't she leave him?" Sarah asked quietly. Carla looked up at her, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Because she loved him, Sarah. She loved him even when he treated her like that. That's the part I don't think people understand. When someone manipulates you, when someone makes you feel like you're worthless without them, it becomes hard to know what love really is." Amanda had convinced herself that Jake's controlling behavior was just his way of showing he cared. She thought that if she just tried harder, if she just lost the weight, everything would be fine. But it was never enough. Carla's words echoed in Sarah's mind long after they finished their conversation. The realization that Amanda had been trapped in a cycle of manipulation and control was heartbreaking. Amanda had been in love with someone who didn't truly love her back, at least not in the way she needed. Jake's obsession with her body and her behavior had nothing to do with love. It was about ownership, about creating the perfect image, about controlling everything in his life, including her. As Sarah sat in her office later that evening, reflecting on Carla's words, she couldn't help but think of all the other victims of toxic relationships, of people who felt trapped in unhealthy cycles and didn't know how to escape. Amanda had lost her life because she was too afraid to break free from a man who had made her believe she was never enough. The truth was that Jake Henderson had killed her, not just physically, but emotionally long before that fatal night. Jake's conviction was a form of justice, but Sarah knew it wasn't enough. Amanda would never have the chance to reclaim her life, to find herself outside of Jake's control. The emotional scars left by someone like Jake could never be fully erased, and the damage done by toxic love was something that stayed with a person long after they had physically escaped. The case had closed, the verdict delivered, but the emotional aftermath was far from over. For Detective Ramirez, it was a reminder of how easily control could take root in a relationship and how important it was to recognize the signs of abuse before it became deadly. As she closed the case file on Amanda Henderson, Sarah Ramirez knew she would never forget her story. Months had passed since the conviction of Jake Henderson, but the case of Amanda's murder still lingered in Detective Sarah Ramirez's mind. The trial had provided a sense of closure for the public, but in Sarah's heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover about the relationship between Jake and Amanda. She needed to understand it more fully, how deep the emotional abuse had gone, how far Jake's control had extended, and how the signs had been missed by those who cared about Amanda. While working through old case files, Sarah came across a few overlooked details in the investigation that piqued her interest. The first was a series of strange financial transactions. Amanda, it seemed, had made several large cash withdrawals in the months leading up to her death. It wasn't unusual for people to withdraw money for various reasons, but the frequency and the amounts raised a red flag. What had she been spending the money on? And more importantly, had Jake known about these withdrawals? Sarah decided to dig deeper into Amanda's financial records. With permission from the estate executor, she requested more detailed information about Amanda's accounts. When the documents came in, it was clear that Amanda had been managing her own finances, and despite Jake's controlling behavior, she had some level of independence. But what was even more intriguing was the fact that she had made these withdrawals in the middle of the night, sometimes as late as 2 a.m. What was Amanda doing at such hours, and why did she feel the need to hide this from Jake? The more Sarah examined the records, the more she began to understand the depths of Amanda's attempts to break free from Jake's control. It wasn't just about her weight or the emotional abuse she had suffered. Amanda had been planning something. She had been taking small steps to build a life outside of her marriage, a life in which she could escape Jake's grip. But in the end, she had been too late. She had not realized just how dangerous Jake's obsession with control had become until it was too late. Sarah also discovered something that shook her to the core. Amanda had been in therapy. The sessions had been kept private, and no one knew about them, not even Jake. Amanda had been trying to work through the emotional damage caused by her marriage. She had reached out for help, but Jake had isolated her so completely that even those who cared for her had been kept at arm's length. Amanda's therapist, who had been working with her for several months, confirmed that Amanda had expressed concerns about her marriage, about Jake's behavior, and about her inability to break free from his control. The therapist had been concerned, but had never been able to convince Amanda to take more drastic steps. She had been afraid of what Jake might do if she left, and so, instead of seeking immediate help, Amanda had tried to continue living her life under the guise of normalcy. Sarah felt a deep sense of sorrow as she read the therapist's notes, realizing how much Amanda had been suffering in silence. She had been slowly eroding under the weight of Jake's expectations, and despite her efforts to break free, she had ultimately been trapped. Meanwhile, Jake Henderson sat in a prison cell, far removed from the world he had once controlled. The reality of his conviction had set in. He was no longer the successful gym instructor, admired for his physique and discipline. He was now a man serving a life sentence for the murder of his wife, a woman he had once claimed to love but had ultimately destroyed. Jake had been silent for weeks following the trial, his mind swirling with regret, anger, and confusion. The truth of his actions had never really hit him until he was alone, locked away with nothing but his thoughts. There were moments when he would sit in his cell and replay the events leading up to Amanda's death in his mind, wondering if there had been something he could have done differently, wondering if she had ever truly loved him, or if his obsession had clouded everything. But Jake's remorse was never genuine. He was trapped in his own justification. He still couldn't see Amanda's death for what it was, a result of his own emotional and psychological manipulation. In his mind, he had been trying to help her. He had pushed her to be better, to be more disciplined, to live up to the expectations he had set. Amanda's death in Jake's eyes was an unfortunate consequence of her own failure to meet those expectations. Jake had never truly understood the depth of his cruelty. He had viewed his actions as a form of tough love, as a way to help Amanda realize her potential. But the reality was that he had been controlling her, suffocating her with his demands. He had refused to see Amanda as a whole person, with her own desires, dreams, and limitations. Instead, he had molded her into a reflection of his own insecurities, using his love as a weapon to dominate her. In the solitude of his cell, Jake began to confront the truth in fragments, but it was too little, too late. There was no escaping the reality that Amanda's life had ended because of his obsession with perfection. The marriage that had once seemed so promising had deteriorated under the pressure of Jake's control. And now all that was left was a painful, irreversible truth. As Sarah continued her investigation into Jake's past, she came across one more disturbing detail. Jake's father, who had passed away years ago, had been a strict and controlling man. It seemed that the pattern of emotional abuse had been passed down from one generation to the next. Jake's relationship with his father had been characterized by high expectations and harsh discipline. His father had never been satisfied with Jake's performance, and the young man had spent much of his life trying to gain his approval. The drive for perfection had been instilled in him from an early age, and now it had claimed the life of the woman he had married. This discovery added another layer to Sarah's understanding of Jake. He wasn't just a product of his own desires and insecurities. He was a product of a toxic family dynamic that had shaped him into the person he had become. His father's influence had molded him into someone incapable of seeing beyond his own need for control. Jake's sense of inadequacy, passed down from his father, had become a driving force in his life, and it had ultimately led to his destruction. Despite everything Sarah had uncovered, one thing remained. Amanda's life was lost, and Jake's was ruined. But the investigation into their marriage had helped to expose a pattern of behavior that was not just about one man's obsession with perfection. It was about the power dynamics that existed in their relationship, the emotional manipulation that had torn Amanda apart, and the cycle of abuse that had ultimately led to her death. As Sarah sat back in her chair, reviewing the case once more, she realized that her work was far from done. Jake's conviction had brought some level of justice, but the case had also brought her to a deeper understanding of the dangers of emotional abuse, of how it could be masked by love, control, and manipulation. The real work, Sarah knew, was raising awareness about these issues, ensuring that others recognized the signs before it was too late. She closed the file on Amanda Henderson's case, but the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. In the end, the most dangerous kind of control was the kind that hid behind a smile, masked as love and masked as care. The truth was, Amanda had been fighting a battle on her own, and though Jake Henderson had been convicted, Sarah knew that the real fight was just beginning for those who were still trapped in similar situations. It was a reminder to Sarah and to anyone who had the courage to listen that emotional abuse could be just as deadly as physical violence. The aftermath of the trial and Jake Henderson's conviction had rippled through Houston like the shockwaves of an earthquake, and for Detective Sarah Ramirez, it had become personal. She had closed the file on Amanda Henderson, but the emotional weight of the case had remained with her. It wasn't just the murder itself that haunted her. It was the quiet, insidious nature of the abuse Amanda had suffered. the psychological manipulation that had led her to believe she was worthless and unable to escape. Jake's conviction had been just the beginning. While the court had delivered its justice, the broader issue, the dangerous pattern of toxic, controlling relationships, remained unaddressed. Sarah knew that it wasn't just about one man's violent outburst. The case had revealed something much more profound: the quiet suffering of countless individuals trapped in relationships that controlled and diminished them. It had opened Sarah's eyes to the invisible wounds that many victims carry, and she couldn't stop thinking about the many people who lived in fear, in silence, without the courage or knowledge to break free. Sarah felt a growing responsibility to do something more with the case, to reach beyond the police department and into the community. She began to speak to local organizations that worked with survivors of domestic abuse, offering her perspective on how controlling behaviors could be just as deadly as physical violence. She wanted to use Amanda's story, painful as it was, to help others see the signs before it was too late. In the months that followed, Sarah partnered with local shelters, domestic violence advocates, and counselors to raise awareness about emotional abuse. She shared Amanda's story, not just as a murder case, but as a cautionary tale. The story of a woman who had been suffocated by the very love that was meant to nurture her. The message was clear: emotional and psychological abuse were just as dangerous as physical violence. The scars were invisible, but the damage was real. Sarah was invited to speak at community outreach programs, at school assemblies, and even on local television shows. Her message resonated with many people, some who had lived through similar experiences, and others who had never understood the silent nature of this kind of abuse. She was determined to make sure Amanda's death wasn't in vain. Every time Sarah spoke to a group of young women or to a couple struggling in a toxic relationship, she felt as though she were giving Amanda a voice she never had the chance to find. Meanwhile, Jake Henderson continued his life in prison, alone with his thoughts, haunted by memories he refused to fully face. At first, he had been defensive, blaming Amanda for everything. But as time passed and he had nothing but his thoughts to occupy him, Jake began to face the reality of what he had done. He started to see how he had destroyed everything in his pursuit of perfection, how his obsession with Amanda's weight, her health, and her obedience had overshadowed the love they once shared. He began to understand, though only in fragments, how his need for control had led to a murder he never intended to commit. In the isolation of his prison cell, Jake had plenty of time to reflect, but the realization came too late. He would never have the chance to rebuild his life, to repair the irreparable damage he had done. He had lost everything: his wife, his career, his freedom, because of his inability to love her unconditionally. Jake's conversations with other inmates about his crime revealed a man in deep denial, rationalizing his actions and still refusing to take full responsibility for his role in Amanda's death. In some moments, he admitted guilt, but the full weight of what he had done, the life he had taken, had not yet settled in his conscience. It was as though he was still trying to justify it, to convince himself that it had been a tragic accident or a misguided attempt to help Amanda. Jake's future was uncertain, but what was certain was that he would never be free again. The walls he had built around himself, both emotionally and physically, had now become his prison. But while Jake remained locked in his own denial, the world outside was changing. The impact of Amanda's death was far-reaching, and the lessons from her tragic story were still unfolding. A year after Jake's conviction, Detective Sarah Ramirez attended a memorial service for Amanda, organized by the same friends and family who had once hoped for a better future for the couple. Amanda's parents, who had been devastated by their daughter's death, were now working to honor her memory in the hopes of preventing other families from suffering the same fate. At the memorial, Sarah was approached by Carla, Amanda's friend, who had become deeply involved in the efforts to raise awareness about emotional abuse. Carla had started an initiative called Amanda's Voice, dedicated to helping individuals trapped in toxic relationships find the support they needed to escape. The initiative aimed to provide resources, counseling, and safe spaces for those who were suffering from emotional abuse, like Amanda had. Carla, her eyes tired but determined, spoke to Sarah about the progress they had made in the years since Amanda's death. "We've already reached hundreds of people," Carla said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But it's not enough. We need to do more. We need to make sure that no one else has to go through what Amanda went through. We have to educate people about the signs of toxic relationships, about control, manipulation, isolation. Because when it's silent, when it's subtle, it can be so hard to recognize. Amanda was just one victim, but how many others are out there? Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of Carla's words. She had seen firsthand how easy it was for someone to be caught in an abusive relationship without even realizing it. And as the world slowly woke up to the true nature of emotional abuse, Sarah realized that the work they were doing was just the beginning. Let's keep going, Sarah said firmly, a sense of purpose growing in her chest. We'll keep sharing Amanda's story, keep raising awareness. We'll make sure that her voice is heard. In the months that followed, Amanda's voice grew, supported by community outreach programs, legal advocates, and counselors. People began to come forward, sharing their own experiences, finding solace in the knowledge that they were not alone. Through their collective effort, Amanda's story lived on, no longer just a tale of tragedy, but one of survival, strength, and the power of breaking the silence. Sarah had found a new sense of purpose, one that transcended the confines of her role as a detective. She had always wanted to make a difference, but now her work was personal. Every time someone reached out for help, every time someone found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, Sarah knew that Amanda's voice was echoing through the hearts of those who had once felt powerless. The case of Amanda Henderson had begun as a murder investigation, but it had turned into something more, a movement, a call to action, and a reminder that the most dangerous kind of abuse often goes unnoticed until it's too late. And for Sarah Ramirez, it was a constant reminder that, in the fight against abuse, there would always be more work to do. It would never be over until everyone knew the signs of toxic love and the world learned how to break free. Months had passed since the memorial for Amanda Henderson, and Sarah Ramirez had immersed herself in the mission to raise awareness about emotional abuse. The initiative, Amanda's Voice, had taken off in ways she hadn't anticipated, helping hundreds of people recognize the subtle signs of toxic relationships and offering them the support they needed to escape. What began as a tragic case had evolved into a movement, a lifeline for those who felt trapped, just as Amanda had been. Sarah was sitting at her desk one morning, reviewing the latest progress reports for the outreach program, when she received an unexpected phone call. It was Carla, the woman who had been Amanda's closest friend and who had helped start the initiative in Amanda's name. Carla's voice was shaky on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I need you to meet someone," Carla said, her words rushed. "I've been working with a woman, Jessica, and her story, it's eerily similar to Amanda's. She's been living in an abusive relationship for years, but she's finally ready to leave him. But she's scared. She's terrified of what might happen if she does. I think she needs someone who understands, someone who's been there." Sarah's heart dropped. She had heard similar stories before, but hearing Carla's urgency made her realize how real and pressing the situation was. "I'll meet her," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Let's do this." Later that afternoon, Sarah met Carla at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of Houston. The air was cool, and the warm aroma of brewed coffee filled the room, but there was tension in the air that Sarah couldn't shake. She had heard about countless survivors of emotional abuse, but this felt different, personal. Amanda's death still haunted her, and the thought that someone else could be living through the same nightmare Amanda had experienced made her stomach twist. Jessica arrived at the cafe looking worn and fragile, a woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was in her mid-30s with tired eyes and a guarded expression. She sat across from Sarah, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cup of coffee. Carla introduced them, and after a few moments of awkward silence, Jessica finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost as if she were afraid of being overheard, but there was a quiet strength beneath her words. I, I've been living in a relationship just like Amanda's, but I didn't know how bad it was until I saw her story," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "My husband, Mark, he's always been concerned about my health, just like Jake was to Amanda. He tells me what I should eat, how much I should weigh, how I should look. But it's more than that. He controls everything I do, who I talk to, where I go. He watches me like a hawk. I never thought it was abuse. I always thought I was just failing him." Sarah felt her heart ache as she listened to Jessica's words. It was almost as if she were hearing Amanda's voice again. Amanda, who had suffered in silence, convinced that her struggles were her fault. Jessica was in the same place Amanda had been, isolated, manipulated, and unable to see her worth outside of her husband's demands. "Jessica, I know how you feel," Sarah said gently, her voice calm yet filled with understanding. "What you're describing is abuse. It's not about love. It's about control. And I know how hard it is to recognize it when you're in the middle of it. But you have to understand. You're not failing him. You're not the problem. He is." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes and she wiped them away quickly, as though embarrassed. "I don't know how to leave," she whispered. "I'm so scared. He's threatened me before. He says if I leave him, no one will want me. I'll have nothing. And I don't think I can do this alone." Sarah reached across the table and placed a hand on Jessica's, offering her a moment of connection. "You're not alone," Sarah said, her voice firm with conviction. "There are people who will help you. There are resources, shelters, legal advocates, people who understand exactly what you're going through. And you don't have to do this on your own. You don't have to stay in a relationship that is killing you, slowly, day by day." Jessica shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried before, Sarah. I've tried to tell him that I'm unhappy, that I need more freedom, but he just shuts me down. He makes me feel worthless. I don't know if I can make it. I don't have the strength anymore." Sarah's heart broke for Jessica. She understood that feeling of helplessness, that weight of years of manipulation and control. But she also knew that strength came from somewhere deep inside, and sometimes it only took a small push, a tiny spark, to ignite that strength. "You have more strength than you realize," Sarah said, squeezing Jessica's hand. "But the first step is recognizing what's happening. You've already done that. Now we can work together to help you get out." In the following days, Sarah worked closely with Carla and Jessica to put together a plan for Jessica's escape. It wasn't going to be easy. Mark, like Jake, had isolated Jessica from her friends and family, making her feel like she couldn't rely on anyone but him. He had made her feel as though she was incapable of surviving without him. But Sarah knew from her own experience, both personal and professional, that it was possible to break free. Together, they contacted a local domestic violence shelter where Jessica could stay temporarily until she could find her own place. They also connected with an attorney who could help her navigate the legal aspects of leaving Mark, including custody of their children and a safety plan to keep her protected. Sarah helped Jessica understand the importance of taking small steps, of slowly rebuilding her life and her self-worth. It wouldn't happen overnight, but with the right support system in place, Jessica could regain her independence and freedom. It was a long road ahead, but Sarah knew that Jessica had already taken the most important step, the decision to leave. 1 month later, Jessica had left Mark. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she feared he might find her and bring her back into his grip. But with Sarah's support and the help of Amanda's voice, Jessica began to rebuild her life. She found strength she hadn't known existed within her. She started therapy, began working part-time, and began reconnecting with her family, whom Mark had kept her from for years. She was slowly regaining her sense of self. Sarah continued her work with the initiative, speaking to more women like Jessica, who had been trapped in emotionally abusive relationships. Every time she met someone new, every time she saw a survivor take their first steps toward freedom, it felt like a small victory for Amanda, whose life had been taken too soon. But the ripple effect of Amanda's death was real. It had sparked something in people, something that couldn't be ignored. The conversation about emotional abuse was finally starting to take root, and Sarah was determined to ensure that it would continue to grow, one story, one survivor at a time. As she stood with Jessica at the shelter support group meeting, watching the woman who had once felt so helpless now standing tall and confident, Sarah knew that Amanda's story hadn't ended with her death. It had become a catalyst for change, for hope, for people who had once felt powerless to break free from the chains of control. Amanda's voice was now heard in a way it had never been before, and Sarah would keep fighting to ensure that it was never silenced again. The case of Amanda Henderson had been about much more than a murder. It had been about a hidden epidemic, a silent killer that tore lives apart, piece by piece. And with every step forward, Sarah knew she was helping to make sure that, one day, no one else would have to suffer in silence again. Months turned into years, but for Detective Sarah Ramirez, the work that Amanda's case had sparked never slowed. Amanda Henderson's tragic death, along with the overwhelming response to the initiative that had been born in her name, had created a movement, one that Sarah had committed herself to for the long haul. What had once been a case of personal guilt and sorrow over Amanda's fate had now become a mission to ensure that no one else suffered the way Amanda had, and that the public, law enforcement, and communities at large would no longer turn a blind eye to the quiet forms of abuse that destroyed lives behind closed doors. As Sarah continued her outreach efforts, collaborating with Carla and other passionate individuals, the program Amanda's Voice grew exponentially. More survivors came forward, and more people recognized the importance of addressing emotional and psychological abuse as part of the broader conversation about domestic violence. Don't have to stay in a relationship that is killing you. Slowly, day by day. Jessica shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I've tried before, Sarah. I've tried to tell him that I'm unhappy, that I need more freedom, but he just shuts me down. He makes me feel worthless. I don't know if I can make it. I don't have the strength anymore. Sarah's heart broke for Jessica. She understood that feeling of helplessness, that weight of years of manipulation and control. But she also knew that strength came from somewhere deep inside, and sometimes it only took a small push, a tiny spark, to ignite that strength. You have more strength than you realize, Sarah said, squeezing Jessica's hand. But the first step is recognizing what's happening. You've already done that. Now we can work together to help you get out. In the following days, Sarah worked closely with Carla and Jessica to put together a plan for Jessica's escape. It wasn't going to be easy. Mark, like Jake, had isolated Jessica from her friends and family, making her feel like she couldn't rely on anyone but him. He had made her feel as though she was incapable of surviving without him. But Sarah knew from her own experience, both personal and professional, that it was possible to break free. Together, they contacted a local domestic violence shelter where Jessica could stay temporarily until she could find her own place. They also connected with an attorney who could help her navigate the legal aspects of leaving Mark, including custody of their children and a safety plan to keep her protected. Sarah helped Jessica understand the importance of taking small steps, of slowly rebuilding her life and her self-worth. It wouldn't happen overnight, but with the right support system in place, Jessica could regain her independence and freedom. It was a long road ahead, but Sarah knew that Jessica had already taken the most important step, the decision to leave. 1 month later, Jessica had left Mark. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she feared he might find her and bring her back into his grip. But with Sarah's support and the help of Amanda's Voice, Jessica began to rebuild her life. She found strength she hadn't known existed within her. She started therapy, began working part-time, and began reconnecting with her family, whom Mark had kept her from for years. She was slowly regaining her sense of self. Sarah continued her work with the initiative, speaking to more women like Jessica, who had been trapped in emotionally abusive relationships. Every time she met someone new, every time she saw a survivor take their first steps toward freedom, it felt like a small victory for Amanda, whose life had been taken too soon. But the ripple effect of Amanda's death was real. It had sparked something in people, something that couldn't be ignored. The conversation about emotional abuse was finally starting to take root, and Sarah was determined to ensure that it would continue to grow, one story, one survivor at a time. As she stood with Jessica at the shelter's support group meeting, watching the woman who had once felt so helpless now standing tall and confident, Sarah knew that Amanda's story hadn't ended with her death. It had become a catalyst for change, for hope, for people who had once felt powerless to break free from the chains of control. Amanda's voice was now heard in a way it had never been before, and Sarah would keep fighting to ensure that it was never silenced again. The case of Amanda Henderson had been about much more than a murder. It had been about a hidden epidemic, a silent killer that tore lives apart, piece by piece. And with every step forward, Sarah knew she was helping to make sure that, one day, no one else would have to suffer in silence again. Months turned into years, but for Detective Sarah Ramirez, the work that Amanda's case had sparked never slowed. Amanda Henderson's tragic death, along with the overwhelming response to the initiative that had been born in her name, had created a movement, one that Sarah had committed herself to for the long haul. What had once been a case of personal guilt and sorrow over Amanda's fate had now become a mission to ensure that no one else suffered the way Amanda had, and that the public, law enforcement, and communities at large would no longer turn a blind eye to the quiet forms of abuse that destroyed lives behind closed doors. As Sarah continued her outreach efforts, collaborating with Carla and other passionate individuals, the program Amanda's Voice grew exponentially. More survivors came forward, and more people recognized the importance of addressing emotional and psychological abuse as part of the broader conversation about domestic violence. Unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Jessica, the woman she had helped escape her abusive marriage. The letter was simple, but it carried a weight of gratitude that made Sarah pause. Dear Sarah, I don't know how to express just how much your support meant to me. When I first met you, I didn't believe I could ever leave Mark, and I certainly didn't think I was worthy of a better life. But you gave me the courage to take the first step. With your help, I found the strength to walk away from the relationship that had been destroying me. I've started rebuilding my life, and it's not easy, but every day is a step closer to healing. I'm finally finding the woman I lost so many years ago. You saved my life, Sarah. I will never forget what you did for me. Thank you for everything. With love, Jessica Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she read the letter. It was a reminder of why she had dedicated herself to this cause. In this fight for justice and healing, every survivor mattered, every story counted, and every step toward freedom was a victory. Jessica was just one of the many lives that had been touched by the work of Amanda's Voice. As Sarah placed the letter in her desk drawer, she knew that there would always be more work to do. The fight for change, for awareness, for the recognition of emotional abuse would continue. But Amanda's legacy would live on through the lives saved, the voices heard, and the survivors who found the courage to walk away from their abusers. Amanda's story had been one of tragedy and heartbreak, but in the years since her death, it had become a beacon of hope, a rallying cry for those who had been silenced, for those who had been made to feel worthless, and for those who needed to know that they were not alone. Sarah Ramirez knew that Amanda's voice would continue to echo in every corner of the world, where people fought for justice, for healing, and for a life free from control and manipulation. And as Sarah stood at the forefront of this movement, she knew that this fight would never end. The journey to end emotional abuse, to create a world where love meant freedom and respect, was a lifelong commitment. But Amanda's story had proven one thing. Even in the darkest of times, change was possible, and one voice could make all the difference.